The corrupt judge had joined forces with the racist officers to mock the black woman standing in court, thinking she was just another case, just another statistic, just another nobody they could humiliate without consequence. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that she was their new boss, and what happened next would leave the entire courtroom, the police department, and the public in absolute shock. It was supposed to be a simple hearing. She had arrived early, dressed professionally, calm but clearly uneasy, because she knew where she was. She knew the building, the cold hallways, the institutional silence that whispered centuries of exclusion. But she had a purpose, a voice, and evidence in hand. She was there to testify against the officers who had harassed her on the street for no reason, slammed her against her own car, searched her body without cause, and laughed as they wrote her up for disorderly conduct, when all she had done was exist in her skin, in her confidence, in her truth. As she stepped up to speak, the judge leaned back in his chair, smirking before even hearing a word. One officer crossed his arms, another whispered something and snorted. Then the judge interrupted her before she could finish her first sentence. "Oh, here we go. Another emotional monologue. Let me guess, they stopped you 'cause you're black, right?" he said, with a performative sigh that dripped condescension. The officers laughed out loud, and one clapped mockingly. "You gotta admit, Judge, she's got the dramatics down," he said. She stood still. Not because she was weak, but because she had learned a long time ago how to hold her power when surrounded by people who tried to make her feel small. But they didn't stop there. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is your profession again?" the judge asked with a sarcastic tilt of his head, flipping through her file as if it offended him. "Says here you're in administration. Government. Cute. That must be tough, lots of emails, I bet." Laughter again. Laughter that echoed off the walls, as if her life, her dignity, her complaint, were all part of some running joke. She cleared her throat, trying to speak again. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I'm here under oath, spare me the theatrics," he interrupted, rolling his eyes. "You people always make it about race. Can't we just stick to the facts?" That's when something in the air changed. Her breath deepened. Her jaw clenched. And for a moment, she didn't just see a judge in front of her, she saw the entire system. Every door slammed in her face. Every time she had to prove she was qualified. Every moment she'd had to smile through disrespect to protect her position, her reputation, her peace. And now, this room, this courtroom, was trying to erase her again. What no one knew, not the officers, not the smirking judge, not even the handful of people in the courtroom watching this unfold, was that she wasn't just a complainant. She wasn't just another voice to dismiss. She was there with authority. Not the kind they gave her, the kind she had earned. And not just earned, but was now in charge of. Because while they were laughing, mocking her presence, they had no idea they were standing before their new superior. Every file she had submitted, processed. Every accusation she made, corroborated. Every word spoken in that courtroom, recorded. And behind that calm expression, behind those unwavering eyes, was someone holding every key to their downfall. What triggered it all? A simple walk to her car after work. 2 officers. No reason. A rough shove. A racist comment. An arrest without basis. A report rewritten. A judge brought in to protect his boys. And all of it, the lies, the smirks, the power games, was about to be exposed. Because the case wasn't just about her. It was about what they'd done to dozens like her. What they'd gotten away with for years. And what was finally going to end. She had been patient. Strategic. Waiting for this moment. And now that they had humiliated her one last time, she had everything she needed to bring their empire of corruption crashing down. But how does someone go from being the object of public humiliation to holding the power to end careers? How did she become their boss? And what did she do in that courtroom, that left even the judge speechless. You're not going to believe how she turned the entire system upside down, and why no one saw it coming. Stick around until the end, because what happened next changed everything. Before we begin today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black viewers. You are seen, you are valued, and your voice matters. Racism in any form is unacceptable, and here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all types of discrimination and injustice. This story, like many we tell, is a reflection of real emotions, real struggles, and real triumphs. It's a reminder that even in the face of disrespect and adversity, dignity and strength will always rise. We hope this story moves you, inspires you, and makes you feel empowered. If you're new here, subscribe to Plow of Twist and turn on notifications. We've got more stories that honor truth, resilience, and justice. Now, enjoy the story. Reshelle Thomas had always walked with a quiet strength that most people overlooked, until they found themselves forced to reckon with it. She wasn't loud, but she never needed to be. Her presence alone carried the weight of someone who had survived rooms not meant for her, decisions not designed with her in mind, and a system that rarely welcomed her kind at the table. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, Reshelle had seen injustice not just as headlines or viral clips, but as lived, repeated, exhausting reality. Her childhood had been framed by stories whispered in the kitchen, of relatives mistreated, of chances stolen, of names mispronounced and futures delayed. Her mother, Janice, was a school secretary who'd worked the same job for 29 years without ever being considered for promotion. Her father, Maurice, had been a city bus driver, a dignified man who wore his uniform with pride and came home each night with stories that made Reshelle both laugh and ache. From them, she learned two things: that dignity doesn't require a title, and that the world rarely hands justice to those who deserve it most. She was never the kind of girl who sat in the back and waited her turn. At school, she had always spoken with measured confidence, earning her both admiration and eye rolls. Teachers praised her poise, classmates accused her of being too serious, but Reshelle was just focused. She saw education as survival. And later, in college, while others were still figuring out their paths, Reshelle was already interning at the city council and drafting proposals that local officials actually read. By 24, she held a dual degree in criminal justice and public administration. By 30, she had a master's in government policy and a reputation as someone who didn't just talk about change, she structured it. Still, none of that would shield her from what was coming. She worked for the Department of Government Oversight, a federal branch tasked with auditing and evaluating local judicial and law enforcement bodies. Her job was to investigate patterns, flag misconduct, and propose structural reforms. She'd been transferred to Richmond, Virginia, just under a year ago, tasked with reviewing the integrity of one of the most problematic judicial districts in the country. At first, Reshelle approached the assignment with her usual discipline, quietly observing, collecting data, making internal assessments. She wasn't new to corruption, and she certainly wasn't naive about the cost of speaking truth to power. But what she found in Richmond was something more insidious, more layered, and far more personal than she could have anticipated. It wasn't just that there were bad cops. It wasn't just that the court had a history of disproportionately harsh sentencing for black defendants. It wasn't even just the whispers about falsified reports or coerced confessions. What chilled her was the culture, the smug, unaccountable tone that echoed through the hallways of the courthouse and police department alike. These weren't men who feared exposure. These were men who believed they were untouchable. And the epicenter of it all was Judge Raymond Keller. Judge Keller had been appointed 2 decades prior and had turned his courtroom into something of a spectacle. To the public, he was tough on crime. To his peers, he was a necessary evil. But to those who watched more closely, he was a performer of power, quick to mock, slow to listen, and surgical in his use of condescension. He had a habit of interrupting defense attorneys mid-sentence, raising his eyebrows in exaggerated disbelief during emotional testimony, and making veiled jokes at the expense of those who dared challenge the system he ruled. And Reshelle, in all her professionalism and preparation, knew exactly the type of man he was the moment she first sat in his courtroom. Then there were the officers, Detective Shane Murphy and Officer Dean Hargrove. They were both products of the same machine. Shane, the louder of the two, often bragged about the cleanups he'd done around town, referring to arrests in predominantly black neighborhoods. Dean was more reserved, but his silence was no less dangerous. He nodded along when Shane made jokes about suspects' hairstyles or accents, and always managed to forget his body cam during key incidents. They were known around the department as the duo, efficient, intimidating, and rarely questioned. Rechelle's encounter with them wasn't supposed to happen. That night, she had just finished a long meeting with local officials and was heading to her car, parked just outside the government building. She was wearing slacks and a blazer, heels that pinched her feet, and carrying a laptop bag filled with case files. She was unlocking her door when she heard a sharp voice behind her. "Hey! Step away from the vehicle." At first, she thought it wasn't directed at her. When she turned around and saw them, Shane and Dean, hands hovering near their belts, eyes already narrowed, her stomach dropped. She raised both hands instinctively, calmly stating her name and position. They didn't care. "Government employee, huh? Let's see some ID. And keep those hands visible," Shane barked. She complied. But even as she spoke with clarity, even as she handed them credentials, their tone never shifted. Shane laughed while inspecting her badge. "Government oversight? Sounds made up." Dean chimed in. "She's got a government badge and a guilty face." They searched her. Touched her hair. Rifled through her bag. Passers-by stared, some with concern, others with indifference. When she asked what the cause for search was, Shane responded, "Suspicious behavior. You looked like you were trying to break into the car." "It's my car," she said. "Yeah. That's what they all say." By the time it was over, her clothes were wrinkled, her bag dumped on the sidewalk, and her voice had gone from firm to trembling. They issued her a citation for disorderly conduct and warned her about resisting questions. She stood alone, shaking, as they walked away laughing. She reported the incident the next morning, filing it through every official channel. She expected retaliation. She expected silence. But what she didn't expect was being summoned to court, to defend herself against their fabricated report. And when she walked into that courtroom and saw the same judge presiding over her case, the same officers standing to testify, she knew exactly what was happening. They were closing ranks. Turning the machine on her. She took a deep breath and sat in the chair. The courtroom was stuffy and small, the walls a sickly shade of beige, the wooden benches marked with years of wear. The bailiff barely looked at her. The stenographer was whispering something to a colleague. And when Judge Keller finally looked up and saw her sitting there, his expression shifted from boredom to amusement. "Well," he said, straightening his robe with exaggerated flair, "this should be interesting." That's when Rechelle knew, this wasn't about the citation anymore. This was about humiliation. This was about reminding her who held the power in that room. But what none of them knew was that Rechelle had already been preparing for this moment, gathering proof, documenting patterns, understanding the ecosystem of corruption piece by piece. Her silence was not submission. It was strategy. And as she sat in that courtroom, watching them gloat, watching them underestimate her in real time, she made herself one silent promise. They would remember her. And they would regret ever believing she was just another name on their list. The courtroom felt colder than Rechelle remembered, though she knew it was the same temperature it always was. Something about the way her heels echoed against the tile as she walked back toward the witness bench made the air feel thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were listening. She could feel their eyes on her, the judge, the officers, the spectators. This wasn't a room of justice. It was a stage. And she had been cast as the antagonist in a performance she didn't audition for. As she adjusted her blazer and sat down, she locked eyes with Shane Murphy for the briefest moment. He grinned. Not a wide smile, but enough to say, "We got you here." Enough to say, "You're not walking out of this the same." Judge Keller cleared his throat dramatically and leaned into the microphone. "Miss Thomas, I would ask that you keep your responses concise and factual. We're here to resolve an incident, not host a TED Talk." He chuckled, satisfied with his own joke, and a couple of officers in the back let out low laughs. Reshelle didn't move. Her fingers remained clasped on her lap, her posture steady. She knew the type, men who needed to reduce others in order to feel large. She began to speak, calmly recounting the incident. Her voice didn't shake, her words didn't wander. But with every sentence, the courtroom became more agitated. Keller interrupted her more than once, reminding her to stick to the question. When she described the search, Shane leaned over to Dean and whispered something that made them both smirk. Reshelle saw it, registered it, but refused to acknowledge it. "Not here. Not yet." The prosecutor, a tired-looking man in his 50s with deep grooves on his forehead, didn't seem particularly interested in challenging anything. He asked routine questions, nodded at the officers' responses, and never once pushed back when they twisted the story. She became agitated, Shane claimed, raised her voice, tried to walk away mid-questioning. Dean confirmed it, adding that her body language was threatening. Reshelle wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it was so naked, so blatant. It would have been comedic if it wasn't her life being torn apart. In one particularly surreal moment, Judge Keller raised his hand mid-testimony and asked, "Miss Thomas, would you describe yourself as someone who has trouble respecting authority?" There was a pause in the room. A long, sharp pause. Reshelle tilted her head slightly, narrowing her eyes just enough to convey the message without needing to say a word. "Excuse me," she finally said, her voice even. Keller smiled. "It's a simple question. Your reaction suggests it might not be." She answered, slowly. "I respect authority that acts with integrity. Not power that hides behind a badge or a bench." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge chuckled again, this time with a forced cough. "Let the record show the witness has an attitude." Throughout the testimony, Reshelle observed more than she spoke. Every micro-expression. Every fidget. Every eye roll that thought it went unnoticed. She had learned to read people long before she learned to outmaneuver them. But this was more than just a trial, it was a test. One she had been silently preparing for over months, with late nights and quiet strategies. Every file she reviewed. Every case she analyzed. Every questionable ruling she flagged. The courthouse was a house of cards. All she needed was the right wind. After the hearing adjourned for the day, she walked out into the sunlight with her head high. Outside, local reporters waited, some with cameras, others scribbling in notebooks. They weren't here for her. Not yet. They were here because the courthouse had been flagged in recent months due to increasing complaints of misconduct. The buzz was building. The city was paying attention. But none of them knew how deep the rot went. None of them knew Reshelle wasn't just another woman mistreated in court, she was someone with access. And she had already started moving the pieces. Later that evening, in the quiet of her apartment, Reshelle reviewed everything again. She pulled out the report she'd been drafting for weeks, a thick document filled with evidence, transcripts, body cam malfunctions, complaint patterns, racial disparity statistics, and internal memos she wasn't supposed to have seen. It was a full audit. And if she submitted it, if she put her name to it, the repercussions would be immediate and irreversible. She called her best friend, Imani, a civil rights attorney in Atlanta. Imani had been her sounding board, her safe place, the one person who didn't flinch when Reshelle spoke about what she was dealing with. They spoke for almost an hour that night. Imani urged her to move smart, not fast. "These men, they've been playing this game longer than you've been watching it. But what they don't have is your vision. Or your spine. Make sure when you make your move, there's no way for them to undo it. The next morning, Relle walked back into the courthouse, not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as a strategist. She stopped by the clerk's office, handed over a sealed envelope, and said with calm clarity, "This is for the Internal Ethics Board. Make sure it gets into the right hands." The clerk looked confused, but Relle didn't stay to explain. Time would do that for her. What Relle didn't know was that Shane had already been sniffing around. He'd heard whispers that she wasn't just a government worker, but something more. He had gone to a friend in city records and tried to pull up her file. It had been heavily redacted. That made him nervous. Nervous men make sloppy moves. And Shane was about to make one. That afternoon, she returned to the hearing. The judge called everyone into the room with a slightly annoyed tone, as if her presence alone was a burden. As Relle took her seat, she felt a shift. She wasn't sure where it came from at first. Maybe it was the way the judge kept glancing at the bailiff. Or the tightness in Shane's jaw. Or how the prosecutor suddenly seemed more alert than usual. Something was brewing. Something just beneath the surface. The judge leaned forward, his voice louder than necessary. "Before we proceed, I've been made aware of a curious submission. An ethics report, submitted this morning. Seems someone believes this courtroom is under investigation." He looked directly at her, eyes narrowed. "Would you know anything about that, Miss Thomas?" She didn't answer. She didn't blink. The judge shook his head slowly. "See, this is exactly what I was talking about. People with agendas coming in and trying to discredit good men." Relle's voice was soft, but razor-sharp. "You should be careful about assuming your definition of good matches the public's." Murmurs rose in the courtroom. The tension became physical, pressing against every ribcage. Shane stood suddenly, fists clenched. "You think you're gonna take us down with your little report? You think anyone's gonna believe you?" Relle turned to him, finally letting a smile touch the corners of her mouth. "No. I think they're gonna believe the footage." A beat of silence. Then two more. The judge's expression froze. Dean looked at Shane, confused. Shane stepped back, face paling. She wasn't bluffing. Because she hadn't just written a report. She had documented everything. She had help. And what was about to come to light wasn't just about a bad night. It was about a system built to protect itself, and what happens when someone walks in with the keys to every locked door. But the shock wasn't just in what she had. It was in who she had become. And they were about to find out, in the worst way possible. The courtroom had never felt that quiet before. Not even during sentencing. Not even during those slow, procedural trials where the tension was drawn out by long pauses and dull paperwork. This silence was something else. It was the silence that comes before a building collapses. That awful, electric stillness where everyone in the room realizes they've underestimated the wrong person. Relle stood without rushing, adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, and took a single step forward. Her heels didn't click dramatically. The room didn't gasp. But the shift was unmistakable. Something was about to be exposed, and no one in that space would leave untouched by it. Judge Keller stared at her, trying to read something in her face. Maybe fear. Maybe apology. Instead, he found neither. His fingers tapped the edge of the bench as if trying to re-establish control, to remind himself who was supposed to have the final word. "Miss Thomas," he said, voice sharp and controlled, "I suggest you clarify what you meant by footage. This is a courtroom, not a tabloid." Relle tilted her head slightly, eyes calm but locked on his. The footage was collected over the last 8 months. Some of it from city surveillance. Some from dashcams that were never submitted to evidence. And some from phones that you, and your officers, thought no one could trace. Dean shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw tense. Shane's bravado drained visibly from his face. His hand rested awkwardly on the edge of the table, fingers twitching like he was trying to figure out whether to fight or flee. "You've been spying on us?" he asked, almost laughing, but there was a sharpness behind the question. "That's illegal." "No," Reshelle replied calmly, stepping closer. "What's illegal is filing false reports. What's illegal is abusing your badge. What's illegal is using your bench to silence and humiliate victims. What I did was document a pattern of behavior, using resources legally accessible through my federal clearance." She turned her head just slightly, her voice now deliberately louder, "because I'm not just a witness here." Keller interrupted with a scoff, standing now, his tone rising. "This is highly inappropriate. This hearing is not the place for conspiracy theories or personal vendettas." "Then you'll be relieved to know this hearing is no longer under your jurisdiction," came a voice from the back of the courtroom. Heads turned. A tall, suited man stepped forward, accompanied by 2 federal officers with official badges visible. The room's collective breath caught. Reshelle didn't look surprised. She simply turned, greeted them with a nod, and stepped aside. The man raised his ID. "I'm Special Agent Relle, Department of Government Oversight and Internal Affairs. This courtroom and its presiding authority are now under federal review due to substantiated reports of systemic misconduct, collusion, and judicial abuse." He gestured to the officers. "Please escort Judge Keller and Officers Murphy and Hargrove to the side room. They will remain there until further instructions." Keller's mouth opened, then closed. "You can't, this is outrageous," but the officer already had his arm. Shane tried to resist, stepping back, but when Dean didn't move, when his so-called partner dropped his eyes and didn't say a word in his defense, Shane seemed to realize the tide had turned completely. Reshelle stepped forward again, her voice quiet now, but deadly steady. "For months, people in this city have been silenced, ridiculed, and broken by a system designed to protect itself. I didn't come here today to beg for justice. I came to deliver it." Keller turned toward her, his face a mix of disbelief and pure fury. "You lied. You set this up." "I told the truth," she replied. "You just refused to listen." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Reporters scrambled out of their seats, camera phones rose into the air, and Reshelle remained still. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply breathed, deep and slow, the way you do after holding your breath for too long. In the private room where the detained men were held, the atmosphere was venomous. Keller paced like a caged animal, muttering legal jargon that no longer held weight. Shane sat slumped, arms crossed, his swagger long gone. Dean stared at the wall, his silence no longer a tactic, but evidence. Reshelle entered the room after being invited by Agent Relle. She looked at each of them, her presence now impossible to ignore. "You want to know the part that should scare you the most?" she asked, voice level. "I didn't come here alone. This isn't just about what you did to me. It's about what you did to hundreds of others. Their stories. Their families. Their names that you forgot the second you locked the courtroom door." Keller leaned forward, sneering. "What makes you think anyone's going to believe some woman who pulled strings behind the curtain?" She didn't flinch. "Because I am the curtain. I was sent here to audit this district under direct orders from the federal board. I have the full backing of the Department of Oversight. Every file you buried. Every complaint you dismissed. Every record you thought was gone, I have them." Dean finally looked at her. His voice was flat. "So this was a setup?" "No," Reshelle said, slowly, carefully. "This was accountability. Something none of you ever imagined would come from someone like me." The silence afterward said more than any argument could. The men who had once laughed in her face now couldn't meet her eyes. Back in the main courtroom, the public had learned what was happening. Phones buzzed with news alerts. Headlines updated live. Reshelle's name was being whispered, then spoken, then repeated. Not as a victim, but as the official who had dismantled the very people who tried to destroy her. When she stepped out into the courthouse steps, microphones were already waiting. Cameras, lights, flashes. She didn't raise her arms or deliver a speech. She simply said, "Let this be a reminder. The system only works when it answers to the people. And some of us are here to make sure it does." The questions came flooding in, but she walked down the steps with quiet composure, her posture steady. Behind her, the courthouse doors remained closed, for the first time in years, not to keep people out, but to keep the corrupt in. And yet, even with all eyes on her, with headlines shifting and systems trembling, Relle knew the real impact of what had happened wasn't in the moment. It was in what came next. Because now that the truth had been revealed, what would justice look like in the aftermath? The holding room felt smaller now, claustrophobic, thick with a silence none of the three men could break. Judge Keller, arms crossed tightly over his chest, kept pacing in sharp, irritated steps. Shane had his jaw locked, knuckles clenched against the side of the chair, and Dean sat completely still, his eyes hollow, lost in a kind of disbelief that had numbed him. Relle stood in front of them again, but this time she wasn't just an investigator or a voice at the other end of a report. She was the one person they had all tried to diminish, reduce, mock, and now, the only one in the room with power. She didn't start with a threat. She didn't yell. Instead, she looked at each of them slowly, deliberately, and then finally said, "You thought you were untouchable because no one ever challenged you in a way that counted. And every time someone tried, you reminded them that this courtroom wasn't made for people like them. But here we are. And you're finally in a room you don't control." Keller scoffed, trying to hold on to some fragment of authority. "I've served the justice system for over 20 years. You think this little stunt of yours is going to rewrite that?" Relle raised an eyebrow, her voice still calm. "You didn't serve justice. You served yourself. You used your robe to bully defendants and humiliate victims. You covered for officers who had no business wearing a badge. You turned the courtroom into a theater for your own ego. You're not a judge, you're an actor with a script of injustice." Keller's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Shane stood up abruptly, chairs scraping loudly behind him. "You set us up," he said through clenched teeth. "This was a trap. You were smiling at us while collecting dirt the whole time. That's messed up." Rochelle's eyes didn't leave his. "You want to talk about betrayal? About someone smiling while planning something behind your back? What do you think you were doing when you wrote that report about me, when you touched me without cause, when you laughed in my face knowing exactly what you were doing? That was personal. But I didn't retaliate out of anger. I responded with accountability." Shane's breath hitched, something between frustration and realization cracking behind his eyes. "You're not better than us," he muttered, but his voice had lost its conviction. "No," she said, stepping closer, her voice low and sharp like a blade, "I'm not better. I'm different. I don't need to abuse power to feel powerful. And I don't have to break people down to stand tall." Dean finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost whisper-like. "This wasn't supposed to happen. We've seen people like you come and go. They talk big, but the system swallows them whole." She turned toward him. "That's because most people try to change the system from outside. I didn't. I became part of it. I studied its language. I learned every loophole, every rule. You never saw me coming because I made sure you didn't know where I was standing." The door opened behind them, and Agent Rose stepped in again, handing Relle a folder. The decision came through. "You're clear to proceed." She nodded, flipping open the folder, her tone now clipped, professional. "As of this morning, Judge Keller is suspended pending federal investigation. All rulings from the past 3 years are under review for racial bias and misconduct. Officer Murphy, your badge and weapon have been revoked, and you are officially under arrest for falsifying evidence, unlawful search and seizure, and abuse of power." Officer Hargrove, you are being placed under administrative investigation for willful complicity. Keller started shouting, furious now. You don't have the authority to do this. This is illegal, this is political. Reshelle turned to him slowly. I have the authority. And what you call political, the rest of the world calls justice. The agent stepped forward to escort the men out, but Reshelle raised a hand. One more thing. She walked up to Shane, who was now visibly rattled. You remember what you said to me that night? She asked. When I asked you why you were detaining me? You leaned in and said, you looked out of place. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned. Well, now you know how it feels. As they were taken out one by one, their steps no longer arrogant, their bodies no longer straight with pride, Reshelle remained standing in the center of the room. It wasn't victory that showed on her face, it was a kind of deep, painful satisfaction, the kind that doesn't come from revenge but from truth finally meeting consequence. When she returned to her office later that day, the staff greeted her differently. The usual glances of curiosity or skepticism were gone. Replaced with respect. Admiration. And in some cases, awe. Not because she had power, but because she had used it when it mattered. In her office, Imani sat on the edge of the desk, watching her with a smirk. Well damn, she said, you really did it. Reshelle exhaled, finally sitting down. I didn't do it alone. But yeah, we did. You know it's not over, right? Imani asked. There's gonna be backlash. Media spin. People saying you were emotional, biased, personal. Reshelle looked out the window, the late afternoon light cutting across the room in gold slants. Let them talk, she said softly. I'm not here to silence them. I'm here to make sure the next time someone like me walks into a courtroom, they don't have to fight just to be heard. Imani nodded, her voice full of something between pride and sadness. You've changed the rules. No, Reshelle said, finally smiling, but just a little. I just reminded them who they were supposed to be protecting in the first place. Downstairs, the courthouse buzzed with reporters, community leaders, and everyday citizens trying to understand how such a quiet storm had suddenly rewritten their understanding of power. Some spoke Reshelle's name with reverence. Others with fear. But none of them could deny what had happened. The woman they tried to humiliate was the woman who brought them all to justice. And yet, even with that done, something heavier lingered in the air. Because what Reshelle had unleashed wasn't just a punishment, it was a precedent. And the system would never be able to ignore her again. The city didn't sleep that night. News stations ran the footage on loop, federal officers walking into a courtroom mid-trial, the public takedown of a long-seated judge, the stunned face of a once unshakable officer as his badge was stripped away in real time. The story spread like wildfire, not just because of the names involved, but because of what it symbolized. For decades, people had spoken in whispers about injustice, about how things worked behind closed doors, how certain people were protected while others were silenced. But no one had ever seen it confronted so directly, so publicly, and by someone they never expected to carry the torch. Reshelle sat in her office past midnight, the city outside glowing with the blue and red pulses of camera crews and late-night headlines. The adrenaline had worn off, and what remained was weight. Not regret, never that, but a pressing awareness that justice didn't end with a headline. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Texts from former colleagues, mentors, family members, strangers from across the country thanking her, asking how they could help, telling her she had given them hope. But mixed in were the other messages. The veiled threats. The accusations. The claims that she had overstepped, that she had humiliated respected men, that she had created division instead of healing. She had expected it. What she hadn't expected was the one message that stopped her cold, an email forwarded from internal communications. It was from a junior officer in the department. A black woman named Karina who had only been in uniform for 11 months. Her message was short, shaky in tone, but raw. Thank you. I thought I was crazy. I thought it was just me. I needed to see this. That was what grounded Rachel again. That was what reminded her why she had done it this way, not through press conferences or Twitter threads, but inside the very halls where people had suffered the most. The impact wasn't in the punishment, it was in the shift. And yet, as the dust began to settle, new challenges rose. The federal investigation team launched a full audit. Every case presided over by Keller, every arrest connected to Shane and Dean, every internal complaint that had been dismissed without follow-up, was now under microscopic review. Some were reopened. Others were escalated to civil rights violations. The city was forced to reckon with not just the corruption, but the cost. Families who had lost years of their lives to unfair rulings. Careers destroyed by planted evidence. Youths labeled as criminals before they had the chance to be anything else. And now, there were lawsuits. Petitions. Demands for broader reform. Rachel found herself in the center of something far larger than her original assignment. In meetings, some city officials praised her. Others, however, looked at her like she was a liability. She could read it in their carefully chosen words, in the way they suggested, calming the storm, rebuilding trust with the community, and finding a balanced narrative. Rachel listened to all of it, but she knew exactly what they meant. They wanted her to clean up the mess, not continue digging. But she couldn't unsee what she now knew, how deep the cracks ran, how many people had learned to survive by pretending the foundation wasn't crumbling beneath them. A week after the arrests, she received a formal offer to take over as the permanent chief investigator of government oversight for the entire region. It was a role that came with real power, permanent placement, and an opportunity to rebuild the framework from the inside. But it also came with limitations, bureaucracy, politics, and the pressure to play nice. Imani called her that night to celebrate the offer, but also to warn her. They're offering you the top seat not just because you earned it, but because now you're too big to ignore. That doesn't mean they want you to keep shaking the table. Rachel understood that truth all too well. With her new position, she would have to make decisions that blurred the lines between justice and strategy. Already, she had been approached by lawyers representing Keller's defense, pushing narratives about his mental strain, his overwork, and trying to position his behavior as the result of institutional pressure rather than individual prejudice. There were meetings where she was told it might be cleaner to settle some of the reopened cases quietly, to avoid dragging the department further into scandal. And then came the real moral knot, Dean's case. While Shane faced clear charges based on falsified reports and unlawful searches, Dean's role had been less direct. He had enabled. He had stood by. He had stayed silent. But he hadn't written false statements. He hadn't physically assaulted anyone. His guilt was inaction, compliance. And now, Rachel had to decide whether that silence was criminal, or human. She scheduled a meeting with him, in private, outside the glare of cameras. They sat in a small, windowless room in a neutral building, no uniforms, no badges. Just two people. Dean looked different without his partner beside him. Smaller. Tired. Not defiant, not angry, just worn. Rachel watched him for a moment before speaking. Why didn't you stop him? He stared at the floor for a while before answering. I don't know. Maybe I thought I couldn't. Maybe I thought it wouldn't matter. You knew it was wrong. I did. And you did it anyway. No, he said quietly. I didn't do it. I let it happen. I let him talk for both of us. I let the culture decide who I was. And now, I don't know who I am without it. That confession sat heavy between them. Rachel folded her hands, exhaled. You're not the only one who's lost themselves in that culture. But the difference is, you're being given a chance to do something with that guilt. He looked up, cautiously hopeful. What kind of something? I want you to testify. Not just about Shane. About the department. About everything you witnessed and chose to ignore. I want the truth from the inside. He nodded slowly. And if I do? You won't get immunity, she said. But you might get a second chance. Not from the system. From yourself. That choice stayed with her long after the meeting ended. Dean's story wasn't just about him, it was about the thousands like him. People who didn't lead the injustice but let it live. And if there was going to be real change, it had to include reckoning with that silence too. As Relle continued to rebuild the oversight division, she started implementing new protocols, anonymous reporting systems, trauma-informed interview processes, diversity-led audit teams. She hired new staff who didn't look like the old guard. She invited community leaders into rooms they had never stepped in before. And at every step, she was reminded that the real battle wasn't the takedown, it was the aftermath. Holding people accountable without becoming consumed by punishment. Offering justice without feeding cycles of retribution. Creating something stronger in the rubble of what had collapsed. She stood one afternoon on the courthouse steps, looking at the building that had once tried to reduce her. The same stone, the same columns. But something felt different now. Not because the building had changed. Because she had. And because others had too. Karina, the junior officer, was now training to become part of the internal accountability team. Survivors of past cases were returning to file appeals. The community wasn't silent anymore. But with all of that growth came pressure. Political figures started calling her decisions too aggressive. Editorials appeared questioning whether she was biased. Former allies turned cold when she refused to bend. And through it all, Relle kept moving. Not because she believed she was invincible, but because she knew that justice wasn't supposed to be comfortable. It was supposed to be uncomfortable enough to shift the balance of power. Still, there were nights she sat alone and wondered if she had done the right thing in the right way. If there was another path, one that could have changed the system without tearing it down so violently. If Keller, for all his cruelty, deserved the public shaming he received. If Dean's silence had made him irredeemable, or just human. Those questions haunted her not because she doubted her mission, but because she was still holding on to her humanity. The city now stood at a crossroads. The headlines were dying down. The reporters had moved on to the next scandal. But the people were still watching. Waiting. Trusting her to continue being the person who had stood alone in that courtroom and dared to speak the truth no one else would. And Relle knew that the real test wasn't what she had already done. It was what she would do next. It had been 3 weeks since the arrests. The city had settled into a strange rhythm, a kind of cautious optimism humming beneath its surface, tempered by years of disappointment and conditioned silence. While some people walked a little taller now, others kept their heads down, waiting for the other shoe to drop. For many, it felt too good to be true. Power didn't just crumble in public. Bad men didn't face consequences in front of cameras. And women like Relle weren't supposed to win, not like that. And yet, she had. Still, the cost was lingering in places no camera could reach. Relle sat alone in the corner of a community town hall meeting held inside an aging high school gym, the lights buzzing faintly above as folding chairs filled with people from every part of the city. She wasn't there to speak this time. She was there to listen. On stage, a young man named Terrence stood with a trembling voice, reading from a crumpled page in his hands. He spoke about how his brother had been sentenced under Judge Keller's court for a nonviolent offense, how they had begged for leniency, how no one listened. His mother sat in the front row, tears streaming silently, her face marked by years of strain. Relle listened carefully, her hands clasped, her eyes heavy. She had seen the file. She had read every word of it. His brother had served 8 years for something that should have never reached a courtroom. After the meeting, Terrence approached her. His eyes were nervous, but determined. "I don't know what happens next," he said, voice low. "I just know, it felt like we were screaming into a void for years. And you turned the volume up. Rachel took a breath. What happened to your family should have never happened. And it wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice made by people who thought no one would question them. He looked at her for a long moment. Do you think my brother will get another chance? She didn't promise him anything. Instead, she answered with the weight of truth. He deserves one. And I'm going to fight for that. But it's not easy. The system doesn't like to admit it was wrong. Terence nodded slowly. But now it has to. That night, she returned home more exhausted than she had been in months. Not from the work, but from the stories. They were pouring in now. Letters. Emails. Handwritten notes. People who finally felt seen, who wanted to be heard. And the more she read, the more she understood that what she had uncovered wasn't the end, it was the beginning of an avalanche. And she was standing at the edge of it. Days later, Rachel walked into a closed-door session with the city's disciplinary review board. It was a panel of 5, 2 city-appointed lawyers, 1 judge from another county, a former officer, and a civilian advocate. They had called her in to discuss the fallout. That's what they called it. Fallout. As if truth were a bomb and she was the one who had dropped it. She sat across from them, their files stacked neatly, their questions loaded with subtext. One of the attorneys adjusted his glasses and said, "Ms. Thomas, there's growing concern among the board that the aggressive approach you took in your investigation has caused instability across multiple departments." She met his gaze. The departments weren't stable to begin with. They were protected by silence. I just turned the lights on. Another board member, the former officer, leaned forward. But there's a narrative growing that you acted out of personal grievance rather than objective protocol. You were directly involved in the incident that sparked this investigation. Some feel your actions were retaliatory. She didn't flinch. If I had let that incident silence me, I'd be complicit. I didn't act out of vengeance. I followed procedure. I collected evidence. I acted when no one else would. And everything I brought forward has been verified. The room paused. The civilian advocate, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a quiet strength, finally spoke. What you did took courage. But now you're in a position of power. And the question is, how do you use it moving forward? Rachel let the silence sit before answering. By remembering what it felt like to walk into that courtroom with everyone expecting me to lose. By making sure no one else has to feel that small again. They didn't respond right away. Some nodded. Some wrote notes. No one dismissed her. After the session, she stepped out into the hallway and found Imani waiting. Her best friend handed her a coffee and gave her a long, knowing look. How bad? Rachel sighed. They're not trying to stop me. But they're watching. Closely. Imani smirked. Let them watch. You've already shown them what happens when you don't blink. But Rachel knew it wasn't just about surveillance. The higher she rose, the more invisible traps appeared beneath her. Allies who shifted with the wind. Leaders who praised her publicly but lobbied privately to limit her authority. She was becoming a symbol, one that inspired some and threatened others. And she hadn't even reached the hardest decision yet. Dean had agreed to testify. His confession, once vague and cautious, had grown into something deeper. He had named names, described how decisions were made behind closed doors, exposed how patterns of abuse were protected by paperwork and coded language. He wasn't trying to save himself, he was trying to make peace with who he had been. Rachel had met with him again, this time not as an investigator, but as a woman wrestling with the weight of her own choices. She looked him in the eyes. Why now? Why tell the truth when it won't change the past? His voice was quiet. Because I can't go back. But maybe. I can stop it from happening again. There was something in his face that reminded her of her father. That same mixture of regret and resolve. And it made her wonder, How many people had been trapped in this system, not just as victims, but as participants who didn't know how to leave? A week later, Relle received word that Keller's legal team had filed for early release citing health concerns. The motion landed on her desk with a quiet thud, accompanied by an internal note asking for her recommendation. It wasn't binding. But it mattered. And for the first time in this entire process, Relle hesitated. She stared at the file. She read every line. His lawyers had painted him as an aging man under stress, overwhelmed by the weight of decades in service. They made no mention of the people he'd hurt. The lives he'd altered. The public mocking. The way he had smiled when he thought no one could touch him. And yet, she thought about justice. About the line between accountability and cruelty. About what it meant to be merciful, not because someone deserved it, but because the person you're doesn't believe in matching darkness with darkness. She called Imani again. If I recommend he stays, he'll stay. If I suggest release, he'll walk with monitoring. Imani was silent for a while. Do you want him to suffer? Relle closed her eyes. I want him to understand. To feel what he made others feel. But I don't know if keeping him inside a cell will do that. Then maybe that's your answer. That night, Relle sat alone with the file on her lap. She thought of the people who had begged for mercy in his courtroom and never received it. She thought of the look in Karina's eyes when she said she finally felt safe. She thought of her parents, of every lesson they taught her about justice and dignity. And she wrote her response. She didn't recommend his release. But she didn't frame it as punishment. She framed it as unfinished business. Because understanding your impact takes time. And Keller had a lot of time ahead of him to sit with the weight of his choices. As she signed her name, Relle felt something in her chest shift, not relief, not triumph, but a deep, complicated peace. The kind that comes when you've chosen the harder road. And stayed true to yourself all the way through it. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet intensity, like a storm cloud hanging heavy in the distance, not yet breaking but felt by everyone underneath it. Relle knew the eye of the storm had passed, but what lingered was just as dangerous, the slow, complex tangle of rebuilding something that had been shattered so publicly. Headlines began to soften. The reporters moved on. The spotlight dimmed, but the consequences remained. Her inbox didn't buzz with as much urgency, but the weight of the unanswered messages told her everything she needed to know. People were still watching. Still hoping. Still hurting. And more than ever, they were relying on her to not lose herself in the aftermath. One morning, Relle sat across from a man whose name had been buried in a file for nearly 6 years. Malik Johnson. Convicted at 21 for resisting arrest and possession, charges that didn't match the incident reports, and more importantly, didn't match the missing dashcam footage that should have cleared him. Relle had pulled his case as part of the audit. What she found was infuriating. No body cam. No lab test. No legal counsel present during key interrogations. It was one of Keller's fastest trials. 42 minutes from arraignment to sentencing. Malik sat with his hands folded tight, his voice low. I remember the day they took me in, not because of what happened, but because of what they told me. You're lucky we're not pressing more. Like I was supposed to thank them for the sentence they handed me. Relle didn't interrupt. She just let him speak, let him take up space. That's something the system had never given him. They called me angry. Said I had an attitude. But I wasn't angry when they stopped me. I got angry when they lied. When they smiled while lying. She finally leaned in. Do you want to reopen the case? He looked at her, unsure. I've already served the time. What's the point now? The point is the truth, she said, her voice steady. It still matters. Even if you were the only one in the room who knew it back then, the world needs to know it now. He took a long breath. Then let's do it. Not for me. For every kid who thought they didn't stand a chance. Outside the courthouse, protests had turned into rallies, and rallies had become strategy sessions. Community leaders were organizing reform boards, independent review panels were being formed, and Reshelle was asked to speak at more events than she could attend. She picked her moments carefully. Not every stage needed her voice. Sometimes, she simply sat among the crowd, listened, watched as people found their own words, their own strength. But the work wasn't without resistance. Inside government offices, quiet attempts were being made to water down the reforms she had pushed through. Budget proposals were delayed. Policy drafts were under extended review. One afternoon, in a meeting with a senior policy advisor, a man named Garrett who had mastered the art of saying offensive things with a smile, Reshelle was told, "We appreciate your passion, Ms. Thomas, but we also need to be realistic. Drastic change often creates instability. We don't want to lose control of the narrative." She stared at him for a long second, then replied without blinking. "You never had control of the narrative. You just silenced the ones who tried to tell it differently." His smile faltered. She stood. Meeting over. Later that evening, Reshelle met Imani at a small cafe tucked into the corner of a quiet block, the kind of place they used to go before everything changed. It felt almost strange to be somewhere normal, surrounded by the sound of clinking mugs and quiet conversations. Imani watched her closely as she stirred her tea, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "You're holding something back," Imani finally said. Reshelle looked up. "They're trying to slow it all down. Not directly. But through policy, delay, distraction. They're waiting for the moment I stop pushing." Imani nodded. "And are you?" "No," she said. "But it's harder now. Not because I'm tired. Because they're scared. And scared people in power. They move in shadows." There was a pause. Imani leaned closer. "That's why you keep going. Because you're the light they didn't expect." The next week, Reshelle was approached by a group of former court staff who had resigned under Keller's leadership. They wanted to speak. Not in whispers. Not behind closed doors. Publicly. They had stories, of altered records, pressured testimonies, warnings they received when they questioned orders. Reshelle arranged for them to testify anonymously to the Oversight Commission. It was the first time some of them had spoken their truth in years. The first time they felt safe enough to. One woman, a clerk named Dana, sat across from Reshelle after her session, eyes full of unshed tears. "I used to leave work feeling like I was helping something. And then one day, I realized I was part of something that hurt people. I didn't know how to undo that." "You just did," Reshelle said quietly. Each of these moments added to a larger tapestry of truth, a narrative far bigger than Keller or Shane or Dean. A story of how a system builds itself to resist accountability, and how it takes people, ordinary, exhausted, scared people, to unravel its lies thread by thread. But Reshelle also knew that truth alone didn't heal. One night, as she walked through the neighborhood where she had been stopped by Shane and Dean, she slowed at the corner where it all began. A boy no older than 13 sat on the steps of a bodega, watching her. His eyes flickered with recognition. "You the lady from TV?" he asked. She nodded, a small smile breaking her face. He squinted. "You really made the judge get arrested?" "I didn't make anything happen," she said. "I just told the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. "My brother got locked up last year. Cops said he ran from them." "He didn't. He just didn't want to die." Reshelle's chest tightened. "What's your brother's name?" He told her. She memorized it. That was the weight of it, every name, every face, another layer of responsibility. She didn't carry it alone, but some nights, it felt that way. Back in her office, Reshelle prepared her next report. A full recommendation for systemic restructuring of officer conduct review boards, a proposal for civilian elected oversight seats, and a demand for mandatory bias and trauma training in all judicial appointments. She worked late into the night, her lamp casting long shadows across the papers. Before shutting it down, she paused, picked up her pen, and wrote a note to herself across the top of the first page. "Don't forget who this is for." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. As she stood to leave, the city outside was quieter now. But it wasn't silence of ignorance, it was silence of attention. They were watching. Waiting. And Relle knew that the storm she had unleashed was no longer something to survive. It was something to lead. In the months that followed, the city began to feel different. Not because the corruption had disappeared overnight or because justice had fully arrived, but because something irreversible had been set in motion. The silence that had once coated courtrooms, patrol cars, and offices was fractured. Voices that had long been pushed into the shadows were now echoing through halls that used to ignore them. The fear that had once protected the powerful now stalked them, and for the first time in decades, the weight of accountability began to match the power they had abused. Relle had not just exposed a system, she had rewired its expectations. Judge Keller remained in federal custody as his trial moved forward. The evidence was overwhelming: altered transcripts, judicial bias, documented cases of discriminatory rulings. His defense team leaned heavily on age, stress, years of service, but the public memory was sharp. No one forgot the smirk he wore when dismissing the voices of the unheard. During the final session of the disciplinary board, when asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he said nothing. Not a word. Perhaps because he had finally realized that no performance could shield him now. He was sentenced to federal prison and stripped of his license and pension. His name would never again sit atop a bench. For the first time in his life, he sat where so many had sat before him, on the receiving end of a judgment he couldn't control. Shane Murphy, the former officer whose arrogance had once filled every room he entered, now found himself a ghost within the very system he thought he owned. With evidence stacked against him and testimonies from victims and even fellow officers, the verdict came swiftly. He was convicted of multiple counts including falsifying reports, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. He was given a lengthy sentence in a correctional facility far from his hometown, no longer protected by the brothers in blue he had once called his shield. His family stopped speaking publicly. His name disappeared from department newsletters and community awards. He was, at last, forced to sit in the silence he had created for others. Dean Hargrove's path took a different turn. After testifying, after admitting his role not in direct action but in cowardly complicity, he was removed from duty. He didn't fight it. He didn't beg for redemption. Instead, he returned to school, enrolling in a social justice program in a neighboring city, dedicating himself to understanding the system he had failed to challenge. He volunteered at community centers, met with those he once ignored, and chose to listen more than speak. His journey wasn't praised loudly, it wasn't meant to be, but those who watched him from a distance saw something unfamiliar in the way he moved. A man no longer hiding from the truth, but slowly learning how to live with it. The community that had once feared its own legal system began to reshape it. Policies changed. Leadership shifted. Civilian oversight was no longer just a concept, it was a reality. Courtrooms were reviewed, officers were retrained, and the idea of justice was no longer monopolized by a select few. The courthouse, once a symbol of silence and intimidation, was now a place where voices echoed freely and no name was too small to be heard. And Relle Thomas rose into a role she had never chased but was born to inhabit. She became the official director of justice accountability for the state, overseeing not just Richmond but every judicial district that needed reform. Her name became a symbol not of revenge, but of restoration. Her face appeared on panels, articles, university walls. But more importantly, her work appeared in legislation, in funding allocations, in real structural change that reached into neighborhoods that had long been forgotten. She never became a celebrity. She became something more enduring, a standard. One morning, she stood at a podium in front of the next graduating class of law students, most of whom had followed her journey from the start. She looked out at them, young and eager, holding notebooks and phones, waiting for inspiration. And Relle didn't give them empty platitudes. She gave them truth. She spoke of fear, of betrayal, of the temptation to become what you fight. She told them that justice was not a moment, not a courtroom victory or a headline, it was a constant recalibration of power. And above all, she reminded them that being underestimated is not a weakness. It is a weapon, if you know how to wield it. After the applause died down, Relle returned to her office. The sun cast a warm beam across her desk, illuminating a framed photograph of her parents, Maurice in his bus driver's uniform, Janice in her school secretary's name badge. They never made headlines. But they had raised a woman who rewrote them. She turned her attention to a letter on her desk. It was from the young boy outside the bodega, the one who had spoken about his brother. The case had been reviewed. Charges dropped. Record expunged. The letter was short but powerful. It said, "You told the truth. And because of that, now we can too." Relle smiled. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry. Not from pain. From relief. From pride. From the realization that justice, when done right, isn't just about holding the wrong people accountable. It's about giving the right people their voices back. Now, take a moment. Think about everything Relle endured. The humiliation. The mockery. The pain of being dismissed, doubted, devalued, not just as a professional, but as a human being. And then remember how she rose. Not by playing their game, but by rewriting the rules entirely. She didn't become what they were, she forced them to face who they had always been. And that's the power of resilience. Of truth. Of integrity. How many times in your own life have you been underestimated? Have you been made to feel like your voice was too small, your presence too invisible, your worth too easy to ignore? Maybe this story reminded you of something you've seen. Something you've felt. And maybe now, you understand that silence is never neutral. That justice delayed is justice redesigned by people who benefit from your patience. So ask yourself, what would you do in Relle's place? Would you have the strength to rise when the world laughed at you? Would you dare to keep going, knowing the weight it would cost you? We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What did this story make you feel? What part struck you the hardest? Let's open a space for reflection, because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're lessons. Warnings. Blueprints for change. And if you believe these stories matter, that your story matters, then subscribe to Tales of Twist. Turn on notifications so you never miss a journey that could change how you see the world. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and remember, sometimes the most powerful revenge is becoming exactly who they said you never could.